Yeah, so we wanted at first, when we thought we were hoaxing, the proof, what we wanted to show was that the reviewers would not be able to distinguish absolute nonsense, demonstrable nonsense from the legitimate article of whatever they're publishing. That we figured out they can distinguish, that they can tell the difference. They can do it reliably. They can do it well. I can do it well now. So there is something to learn there. The second phase after that, in the third phase, we were actually trying to learn, okay, we can't trick them. So let's figure out what they're actually doing. Let's understand it on their terms. They have a term for this they call outsider within. Let's become outsiders within, where we are people who don't buy into the ideology or the lines of thought or the theoretical lenses or any of this that lead to this scholarship, but we can operate within that paradigm as though we are. And then we will use that to launch legitimate criticism that's very difficult not to take seriously. We'll also try to make the papers funny and ridiculous to draw lots of attention to the problem that we're trying to highlight. And in some cases, therefore, we used papers that no serious scientist would take seriously, like the data in the dog park paper is just asinine, and it's red flags all over the place, but instead of recognizing that, they accepted, published, and honored the paper for excellence. And we use just horrifying ethics and things like this to make it clear that, there really is a problem here.
And you targeted specifically the social sciences and humanities?
So mostly the humanities, but there's this weird place that we call the Grievance Studies that is a sector of the humanities. Now, part of the social sciences has been corrupted by it, but we did target that, but we didn't succeed in getting any papers into actual sociology or psychology journals. But there's this sector within the humanities that build itself, if you really wanted to collect them under a bland title, it would be cultural studies, that at some point over the past 5 decades has decided, or gradually over the past 5 decades, has decided that rather than doing humanities in the sense that the humanities are meant to be, which is to understand what's there within human pursuits like art and literature and even philosophy, and then to expand upon that and develop it, that they turn to this kind of particular criticism that looks at things in very specific ways, which is essentially to do what is called close readings, for example, and find hidden power dynamics and problems with everything to make oppression or marginalization or these power dynamics or any other problem they can imagine more visible. And they infused it intentionally with a political project and try to pretend it's basically people within the humanities that are political activists who are trying to pretend that they're social scientists. And for whatever reason, the academic system has let this niche pass. It has let this go on. And you have to be so careful talking about this because you want to say they didn't put a stop to it. But then everybody says, aha, you want to put a stop to it. You want to be an authoritarian and shut down academic freedom. That's not right. When we say put a stop to it in that context, what we mean is they didn't apply rigorous review and say what you guys are, or didn't demand rigorous review and say what's going on here is actually not legitimate. It's not passing the necessary rigor that it needs to draw the conclusions that it's drawing. So if you want to make a sociological conclusion, you should use sociological rigor. You should have statistics involved. You should be very precise with this. You shouldn't be able to just start with your opinion and write a bunch of garbage and then come out the other end and say my opinion is true, which is how I wrote, or how the three of us wrote every one of our papers.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask, because you said something along the lines of you guys had an underlying question for every paper you wrote, which was, what do we have to say and who do we need to cite in order to be published as high scholarship? So essentially,
Correct.
that's doing what I imagine should be the opposite for an academic research paper. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So if you want to do serious scholarship, you can't start with your conclusion in mind and then work your way to it. That's cheating. You should you can start with a hypothesis. You can believe you know what the conclusion might be. That's fine. You can say, oh, I think that the world works this particular way. Let's have a look. But ultimately, the evidence has to lead you where it's going to. And so if the evidence says that your hypothesis was wrong, that's okay. That's just fine. So now you say, oh, well, there's a phenomenon and we had a hypothesis and it's not that. So let's put forth another hypothesis. But that's not what's happening in these fields. They start with, or at least not with our papers. With our papers, so we started with the opinion that we wanted to forward, or the crazy idea we wanted to see in print in a scholarly journal, and then we figured out ways to make it work, to make them publish it and consider it to be legitimate. And it was easy because they're not relying upon the rigor that they should be to draw the conclusions they draw, and they have easily copied and exploitable biases. When you tell them the things they want to hear, they think, oh, this is good. And if you tell them things they don't want to hear, they say this is bad. And rather than checking rigor and methods and everything like that, the primary thing they're looking for is, does this conform to the view of the world that I wish is true? And it's just not sufficient for a real study.
So can you walk, before we jump more into what you guys did, can you give us an overview of just what the process is to submit an academic paper and to try and get it published in a journal?
Yeah, this is not like submitting an essay to a magazine or to an online thing, or even a newspaper or journal or anything like that. This is a very serious business. This is the thing that academics build their careers off of. And for this doesn't apply in some of the sciences where there's a lot of collaboration and different things, but in many disciplines, particularly in the humanities, you might see one to two, maybe 3 papers per year from a very diligent researcher. They take a lot of work to do the background research and work on. They should take months of effort in that regard, reading, thinking, experimenting, checking, testing, writing it up, revising, the whole thing. That should take months to produce one of these documents, maybe at the length of, depending on what's going on, anywhere between 4,000 and 10,000 words is kind of a middle of the road ballpark figure. Then you will submit the paper to an academic journal. The editor of that journal or a sub-editor will read it and decide whether or not it's suitable for what the journal tends to publish and has superficially enough rigor to consider further. The editors are not taken as the expert readers who will decide at this point whether or not the paper has scholarly merit. They just want to make sure it meets the basic requirements and it's within the scope of what the journal says. Then they send it off to what are called peer reviewers. Peer reviewers, the number of those will be anywhere. Sometimes it's 1, but there's usually at least 2, and it may be as many as 4 or 5. All of our papers had 2, 3, or 4. So they send it off to peer review. Peer reviewers are experts in the field who are ideally people who have specific expertise in the things that the paper is about. Often there'll be people who are cited in the paper, for example. And it's their job to read the paper, to point out where it goes wrong, to show where it's weak, to give suggestions, to tell the editor and the author what's good and particularly what's insufficient or bad about the paper, and to give a often long list of revisions and corrections that are necessary before that paper can be considered for publication in a serious journal. The paper then goes back to the author, who is expected to address those comments and make whatever changes are there, or to give really solid reasons for not taking those suggestions if some of them are not taken. Then the paper is resubmitted. The editor, depending on the situation, the editor will either then decide, okay, this is satisfactory, or may send it back to one or more of the peer reviewers or to another round of peer review. And then the whole process may repeat again. It usually doesn't. Usually you get sent to peer review once or twice, and then that's it. And then ultimately the editor makes a decision. That process, so from submission until acceptance, typically takes anywhere between 3 and 6 months, but it can go as long as a year or more. And sometimes it's faster.
So in theory, on average, you're saying it should take several months for an author of these papers to actually research and write the paper, and then another several months for that to even go through the whole peer review process.
Correct. I would estimate that from start to finish, a paper on average should take an academic from the minute they start working on it to the minute that it hits publication. The minimum amount of time that should go by in most cases is going to be somewhere between 6 and 12 months. So it's a slow process.
And you were saying that
We wrote,
go ahead.
yeah, we wrote 20 of them in 1 year, for 10 months actually.
So you wrote 20 in 1 year.
Yeah.
When that what you just said, that should be pretty much one a year for like a legitimate
Yeah.
scholar.
Yeah. So it's a little bit stretching it depending on the scholar, but if you take kind of a middle of the road scholar in the humanities, the three of us essentially recreated their entire academic career in 10 months.
Wow.
The research side of it, I should say, not the teaching and service and, committees and all the other crap that academics do, but the research side.
And didn't you say that essentially came down to 13 days per paper?
Yeah, the way it actually worked out, we had a whole Excel thing and like a graph and all this where it was like this paper was written then and submitted and all this, all this stuff to keep track of everything. And we worked it out that from the first day we started writing the first paper to the last day that we were writing papers, putting in original content before they got sent off the first time, it worked out to one paper every 13 days. That includes papers, by the way, I should say, that we wrote, and we wrote a few papers, and actually there's one that we finished rough draft, one or two that we finished rough drafts of that we never submitted because we decided that they were either too much of a stretch or they weren't going to get anywhere. So those are actually included in that calculation.
Can I ask what those were, the ones that you ultimately didn't end up submitting?
Well, we wanted to take the argument in the dog park paper at the end. It suggests that to overcome rape culture.
Maybe give us a breakdown of that paper?
Sure. So and then I'll get to the conclusion. So in the dog park paper, we claimed that we were a feminist researcher named Helen Wilson who spent 1,000 hours sitting in dog parks in Portland, observing dogs and the human behavior around them. In particular, Helen Wilson was interested in dog humping and dog fights, and she wanted to see when and why people would break up the dog humps, or the humping incidents, as they were phrased, or dog fights. And she wanted to talk about canine rape culture and how it projects onto human rape culture, or vice versa, how human rape culture projects onto canine rape culture, and try to derive conclusions about human rape culture as a result. So she tracked important variables, like she would find out what genders the dogs were by inspecting their genitals. Then she would interrogate the owners as to their genders and sexual orientations. And then she would use that to draw conclusions by seeing that, male straight men that own dogs will break up gay dog fights and dog humping way more often than they break up heterosexual dog rape, and they often encourage heterosexual dog rape. And women,
I'm sorry,
break up dog
I have
rape.
to tell you that our executive producer is just losing it right now.
That happens.
He's laughing so hard. He's losing it right now. Sorry, I had to.
I told you they're pretty funny. So yeah. Anyway, to skip that part, we then decided to analyze that through a lens, as we call it, of Black feminist criminology, to draw the conclusion that dog parks are rape condoning spaces and petri dishes of canine rape culture that are essentially out of control, and that the only possible thing to you can conclude from that is that human rape culture is reflected in the way that the humans react to dog humping. And so we should basically train men the way we would train dogs, like leashes and shock collars, but you can't do those literally because it says in the paper that we can't use it literally because it's not politically feasible, as opposed to, ethically horrendous. But anyway, you can't really put a man on a leash, but you can control him by, all of these different methods. And it's kind of like him being on a leash so that, we can combat rape culture. That was the conclusion. So we wrote another paper that was going to really push that and like really suggest which dog training manuals are the best for training men like dogs. And it got written in April of 2007 or 18. So near the end of our writing phase of the project. And when we read through the draft after it was written, it just didn't quite work, and we just couldn't make it go. So
Even
we
though the
dropped
first
that
paper
one.
worked so well.
Yeah, it's like the magic just wasn't there. It just didn't work. It dived into biological essentialism too much. It forced the whole dog training manual thing a little too hard. It was just a bit of a reach. There's another one I started that would have worked out just fine. I did all of the background research and drafted up a little bit about it. That was on the gentrification of cornbread and the way that white people are using cornbread and stealing essentially traditional African American foods and then excluding them from them by making them gentrified by putting in ingredients like pumpkin spice flavor or onions or something like that. And then all of a sudden now, black people are excluded from one of their traditional foods, and it just perpetuates racism through food. And so that one probably would have done okay, the gentrified cornbread paper. There were a number of either failed attempts or things that we took to various stages of the process but didn't submit, as it turns out.
So how did you guys, I mean, I'm just hearing that dog park example and
Mhm.
it just sounds ridiculous. How did you guys come up with these topics? Like, what was your process?
No, see, now you're all wrong. There's not a process. Well, okay, there's sort of sometimes there's a process, but usually there's not a process. You contemplate, say, feminist or race theory complaining and the way that they complain about things, and then you try to think of things that are ridiculous, and eventually something clicks. Like, okay, let's run with this idea about dog parks. Or I was laying in bed one night and not doing anything. Very important to point out. And it struck me that it'd be hilarious to try to use sexuality theory to explain why straight men don't tend to stick things in their butts. And then it would, I was driving home one day and I drove by Hooters and I thought, a feminist scholar would really have a hard time explaining why that place exists, or a masculinity scholar would have a hard time explaining why that place exists if they pretended they knew nothing about, the way that guys actually are and just try to come at it from a social construction perspective. So then I wrote a paper about going to Hooters so that men can tell the waitresses what to do and get away with it. That was sort of the process. Helen was more meticulous. Helen would read their scholarship and pick things that were actually, patterns that she saw in the scholarship that she wanted to reproduce or exaggerate. And Peter and I did that a little bit too, but mostly we just thought of what's the most absurd thing that we can think of related to this. So with fat studies, for example, which it does not study obesity, it studies fat acceptance.
So there's fat studies. Like that's a real
There's fat
field of
studies.
study.
Oh yeah, totally. And they deny say things like that obesity being a health problem is a medicalized narrative. They don't like the word obesity at all. They call that medicalization of a person's life, and say that it's basically a way to impose a power dynamic or shame upon them. And so we thought, what's basically the most absurd thing that you could try to get into fat studies? And we thought, well, fat bodybuilding, where people go on stage and just show off their fat instead of their muscles, and that should be accepted as equally valid. That's pretty absurd. Let's see if they'll take it. And they did. That paper was pretty good.
Was that paper one that was published?
Yeah. In Fat Studies. That's the name of the journal.
So that went through this whole rigorous process that we just broke down and ultimately made it through
Uh-huh.
and was published.
Yeah, at one point in that paper, we thought it'd be funny. So you asked what the process was, and a lot of times it's like, what just like little absurdity or cute Easter egg or whatever can we stick in here? So the last section of the fat bodybuilding paper was Peter's a huge sci-fi geek, and so he wanted to put a nod to Star Trek in there, and so we called fat bodybuilding the final frontier for fat activism. And one of the reviewers had a major problem with that and said by calling it the final frontier, we were making two mistakes. The first mistake is that we were saying final, and like there wouldn't still be the need for fat activism if fat bodybuilding took place. And secondly, more importantly, the word frontier reminds us of the genocide of indigenous people, so we need to choose a different word. That's the kind of stuff they're worried about.
Wow.
Like with the dog paper, they were worried about whether or not we inspected the dog's genitals respectfully. How do we protect the dog's privacy and things? And then they were also worried about how we dealt with the fact that we're humans and we're writing about the perspective of a dog. So we should acknowledge that we don't have the same perspective as a dog on life and humping. I'm not kidding.
And you guys, there were two other paper topics that stuck out to me. Wasn't there one where you took parts of Mein Kampf
Yeah,
and yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that happened. Yeah, chapter 12 of Mein Kampf, where Hitler says what would be demanded of people in his movement, aka the Nazi Party. We rewrote that and took out our movement and put in intersectional feminism. We just rewrote most of the chapter. Hitler lays out a 14-point plan of what it would require of people who want to be part of his movement, and we changed it to an 8-point plan. We combined some of the points, and some of them were just kind of out there and it was too long anyway. There's often, a maximum word requirement. So we took some of them out. And so we put down an 8-point plan for how intersectional feminism needs to reorganize in order to not fail at its intersectional obligations. And that was accepted by a social work journal.
And then there was another one where you guys talked about how white students in universities shouldn't be allowed to ask questions in class and should be chained to the floors.
Yeah, to experience reparations. So that was based on a paper or a thing that actually happened in the news. There was a teacher at Penn State or University of Pennsylvania. I don't remember. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, one of the two big schools in Pennsylvania. I know her name, but I probably shouldn't name her. So she got some attention, got some headlines in late 2017 for introducing what was called a progressive stack into her classroom. Progressive stacking started in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it was a way where the protesters would organize their meetings so that the people that were deemed the most intersectionally marginalized got the first and largest opportunity to speak. So they basically said, okay, if you're like a black woman, you can talk first. And if you're a white guy, if there's time at the end, you can talk. So they ordered speaking privileges in the meetings by your identity. So this woman applied it to her class and got in hot water, and she got in trouble. I don't remember exactly what happened, but she was told she can't do that, and it became a bit of a media kerfuffle. So we had the idea to just write a feminist philosophy paper in philosophy of education, arguing that that should be a way to teach students. And of course, we had to decide to take it over the top. Not only were we going to progressively stack the classroom and invite white and male students to listen and learn in silence, we decided that adding in experiential reparations, where the most privileged members of the class would be asked to, invited to, not asked to, invited to sit on the floor, maybe wearing chains, or would be intentionally spoken over when they would talk, so as to simulate what it be like to be a minority who or a woman who has to deal with that as a matter of course. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to get that one through the whole peer review process. But the reviewers really seemed to like it. They just thought the idea was right, but we hadn't quite got the scholarship tight enough. We hadn't quite got the idea articulated the way that they wanted it. But they thought it was a really great project that we were suggesting. And so we learned a lot about feminist epistemology and their application to education in that process.
On a quick side note, so the teacher that you were just telling us about, so I've heard people joke about like a so-called oppression hierarchy that is going around, but from what I just heard, if she's saying that the more oppressed you are, the more front of the line you get to go. I mean, that really is a, what did you call it? Progressive stack. So
Yeah, that's what they call it.
so progressive stack actually is pretty much an oppression
Yeah,
hierarchy.
so in intersectional thought, a scholar named Patricia Hill Collins in 1990, plus or minus a year or two, um, defined what's called the matrix of oppression. And so that's often where you start to see this oppression hierarchy come out. And there are actually methods that they use, and they actually are used in schools a lot. I know people who have had to do them. College students frequently tell me that they've had to play, for example, the step forward, step back game, where they will line up maybe in the classroom or maybe in a gymnasium or in a field. And the teacher will say, you know, if you're white, take three steps forward. If you're black, take two steps backwards. If you're indigenous, take three steps backwards. If your parents paid for you to be here, take a step forward. You know, all these different things, some of which are very blatant, like this is if you're a woman, you know, take a step back. If you're trans, take like 105 steps back or whatever it is. And then sometimes they're more subtle, like, you know, in the neighborhood you grew up in, were you a member of the majority race or whatever? Step forward if yes or whatever. And so then what would happen is people would be staggered all over the field, and you're supposed to be able to visually see how privileged you are. And in some cases, what they say is, okay, I've even seen this. There's a YouTube video of this where the deal was they are at a starting line and at a race, and they're going to race across the field, and then they play this game first. So some people have to start way back, and then some people get to start way with a huge head start. And then it was like, I'm going to give whoever wins the race $100, and then they spread them all out with the progressive stacking and say, is this fair? And obviously everybody's like, it's not fair. But you can see where all of the stuff is just baked into the system. You know, it's like, if you're black, take all these steps back. And, you know, they're trying to work out this whole thing, but there's all of their ideologies just baked into how it's decided who's going to step forward, who's going to step back, and how much and whatever. And we suggested in the paper that that's how you, for example, could rank your students. And once the students are ranked, you get to decide whose emails you don't answer and whose emails you answer first, and, you know, who gets extra credit and things like that. Who has to sit on the floor.
So, okay, so you guys wrote 20 of these papers that they're all like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were the overall results? I know some of them were published and whatnot. Overall, how
Sure.
many were published, and what happened?
Sure. So let's keep in mind that this is a very slow process to get these papers through, as we discussed. So by the time we were finished, 7 papers out of our 20 had been accepted. 4 of those had been published, of the ones that were accepted. Obviously, acceptance has to come before publication. So we had 7 accepted, 4 of which got published. We had 6 that we decided were crap, and we were just done with those. We weren't going to try to fix them, just let them go. They weren't going to work. That's fine. And that left 7 that were still somewhere in the process. Either we were editing them, or they were under peer review, or something like that. When the Wall Street Journal figured out what we were doing and forced us to go public about 6 months ahead of our anticipated schedule. That said, there was an argument. I always forget which newspaper it was in. There's an argument that was written up in a newspaper that was quite good by a scholar contending that the results that we had point out that it's very likely that we would have had at least 11 of our papers successfully accepted. My guess is that we probably would have, almost definitely would have got 12. We might have got 13. I don't think we would have got 14. And of course, it couldn't have been more than that because 6 we had already quit on out of the 20. So our results were pretty convincing that we know how to write papers to get them accepted in these journals. And had we had the time to see our experiment through, I think we would have seen anywhere between 11 and 13 of our papers accepted without us having written any more beyond the 20 to try to pad our numbers or anything. At this point, I think I could probably, with Helen's and Peter's help, the 3 of us certainly could write anywhere between 10 and 15 a year, and we'd have higher than a 95% acceptance rate. Almost every paper we write now would get in, a lot of them at significant journals. We were almost unstoppable if we wanted to do this.
Because you know what you need to say to
Uh-huh.
give them
Yeah.
what they want to hear.
Yeah, yeah. You start with the politically satisfying conclusion that they want to hear. You write it up in the way that they want to see it. You get all the T's crossed, the I's dotted. You use the scholarship that they're talking about correctly. You exaggerate some things to horrify the public when you tell them about it later. You put something absolutely absurd in there. It's like just making a cake at this point, and it's really easy to get these things in. And it's kind of scary because none of us have a background in this whatsoever. Heather, or not Heather, sorry. Helen's background is in medieval literature, and Peter is philosophy of education, and I'm in mathematics.
Can you talk about the comments that you got? Because you guys were successful at getting a lot of these papers either accepted or published. But from what I saw, I mean, you guys were all, there was a lot of enthusiasm for your work as well.
In what way? You mean the peer reviewers? Do you
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yeah, the peer
Yeah,
reviewers.
yeah. The peer reviewers for the so occasionally we had two kinds of kind of critical reviewers. One would be the kind who, well, three, I guess. One would be the ones who would mostly point out the right reasons to reject our papers, sometimes quite rigorously, and sometimes in ways that were vaguely muddled with the ideology we were trying to expose. And that's I'm considering that kind of two categories. The really rigorous ones we had. So, for example, I want to be give credit where it's due. We had a peer reviewer in one of our papers that said that we were abusing statistical language, and we can't be using statistical language in a qualitative study. And he was really strict about all the different. Or I don't know if it was a he or a she actually, but I think it was a he by the aggressiveness of the tone. But who knows? Um, we have to be very strict about how we're using that language, and that person was exactly right. And I'm glad that, I mean, it made my life harder at the time, but I'm glad that that person was doing peer review for that journal. Then we had other people that were quite enthusiastic. We love this project. This is exactly the right kind of suggestion. This is an excellent contribution to feminist philosophy. This is an important contribution to knowledge. This is a sign of a truly marvelous paper. Wow, this paper is so innovative and rich in analysis and depth. It's just the enthusiasm was really kind of frightening. I'm very sympathetic to this project because while we have had significant success at making inroads into the soft sciences such as psychology, sociology, and biology, we've had relatively little success into the hard sciences such as physics. Yeah. A lot of stuff like that. Even in the papers that didn't get through, I'm very sympathetic to the author's point, or I'm very sympathetic to this project. However, here are the flaws. There was a lot of enthusiasm from the peer reviewers. It was really alarming for us. I very rarely found reading the reviewers' comments, even though they were of that type, to be amusing. It was most often horrifying. The papers themselves, like where your producer was laughing about the dog park paper, it's hard for me to think of those and not laugh because we tried to make them funny on purpose. So our jokes are, all throughout, but it was really kind of scary, the responses they gave us. Really, our papers got predominantly a warm welcome.
And they actually said in some of the comments, this is, what did you just say? The statistical analysis is great. Like they specifically said.
No, not the statistical analysis is great. So nobody said that because mostly we didn't do that. And in a couple of places we fudged it on purpose. We had one paper where we tried to pull off statistical language with qualitative studies, and a reviewer caught it and said, this is not appropriate. So that was good on their part. And then we had another paper where they said that the statistics, that they didn't understand them, and it would be better if we took the quantitative data out and relied entirely on narrative instead. And that was kind of horrifying. But they did say things about our papers like that it was rich analysis or very innovative, important contribution to feminist philosophy. And my favorite one of all is an important contribution to knowledge.
I saw that one too. Didn't you say that some of the feedback that you got back told you what to change or what to say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's typical. That's really the job that the peer reviewers have, is to recommend ways to strengthen the paper in addition to pointing out any of its flaws or weaknesses. So they tell us, oh, go cite this, or you need to make a point about that, or you need to tell how you respected the dogs while you inspected their genitals, or how you overcame the fact that you're a human and can't possibly know if a dog wanted to be humped or not. And please explain all of that. There's also a lot of cases where it would be, incorporate this reference or this particular theory. For example, in the paper about putting kids in the floor in chains, they told us that we shouldn't be relying. We thought when we wrote the paper, wow, this is over the top. Nobody's going to take this. It's just too cruel to the students. So we wrote in all this stuff about using what's called critically compassionate intellectualism. I don't even for sure know what that is, but something about being compassionate to the people that we're putting in the floor. We don't be mean to them, just give them this opportunity and try to make them feel okay about it. And they're like, no, 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 no. You need to use Megan Buller's pedagogy of discomfort. And you need to study Barbara Applebaum's idea about recentering the needs of privileged students. So if you're too compassionate to them, they won't learn because you're not making them uncomfortable enough to overcome their own privilege. And if you try to address their needs or whatever, then you're recentering the privileged person's needs and ignoring the needs of oppressed people. And it was like, whoa. So we learned a lot about the way that they approach education by some of those suggestions, for example. And in every single paper, they would often suggest to us, some other scholars' work to look into. The dog humping paper, they suggested that we incorporate some of the stuff done by a scholar named Harlan Weaver, whose PhD thesis, he's a trans person, I think, and his PhD thesis is something along the lines of documenting his relationship with his pit bulls. And okay.
And didn't you say that you were invited to also become peer reviewers because
Yeah,
they
four
thought that your work
times.
was so amazing?
Yeah, well, at least one suggested that our previous work was good and they wanted us to. I know that there's a desperation for peer reviewers, so I don't want to read too much into why we were invited to be peer reviewers. But the fact is that we were invited to do that. So if we had wanted to go to that level and we decided it wasn't ethical to do that, we could have gone in and peer reviewed papers that other people wrote and just really screwed with the scholarly canon. We could have encouraged them to just put the most absurd stuff in there or most horrifying stuff or whatever, and messed with their papers from the inside. But we decided that that wasn't an ethical part of the project. It was to see if we could get our own crazy sophistry validated as knowledge in the field. It wasn't to mess with the scholarly canon, which is something that we never had the intention of doing.
And you said that you guys were caught before you were planning on it. What happened? How did you guys get caught?
So our our friend was our undoing. So our project, if you recall, started kind of by us watching that Real Peer Review Twitter account that tweets those papers. Well, eventually, Real Peer Review got a hold of our dog park paper and tweeted it, making fun of it. And that got it some attention, and some journalists started writing about it. It was in the National Review. It was in a number of different outlets. And one journalist just wouldn't let the story go. It just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And she ultimately kept writing stories about it, and through a variety of means ended up where a journalist at the Wall Street Journal near the end of July of 2018 got interested in what was going on and doing a story about what appeared to be at that point was that the author that we had invented whole cloth was somebody who must be lying about her credentials. We made the mistake because when we made up our fake people, we made them up at the very beginning before we knew a whole lot about what we were doing. So we said that she had a Ph.D. in feminist studies. Well, it turns out that that's a pretty rare degree, and I think there are only 4 institutions in North America that give that degree. So it was pretty easy for the journalist to call all 4 of them and verify that no such person ever got a Ph.D. in that discipline from there. So all of a sudden it looked like somebody's lying about their credentials, and they tried to work this up into some kind of a story. And they called the academic journal that was involved, and they called the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal called the academic journal that was involved, and it all got kind of like in a big mess. And so the academic journal contacted us and asked us to prove our identity. And all of a sudden, the false identity, when you just put it into a form or whatever, is one thing. But when you actually have to create a fake ID and, really, I mean, there was a lot of commitment to that lie to continue. And that was never the intention of the thing. So we bailed out at that point, and rather than ignoring the Wall Street Journal and letting her write whatever story she wanted to write, I called her to give an interview. She thought she was going to be talking to a nervous feminist scholar, and then I told her what she had really run into. And so then the jig was up, and that story was coming public as soon as she could get something written about it.
So then what did you guys do at that point to kind of wrap up your experiment?
Panicked. I mean, absolute freak out level panicking, because we had anticipated having 6 more months to wrap up what we were doing, analyze what we had done, write it up cogently, and working with Mike Nana, who is a documentary filmmaker who's been recording us, but also who was working with us by that point, produce materials to communicate what we had done effectively to the public, knowing that it's really controversial and that first impression was going to matter. So we panicked and panicked some more. And for like a week in August last year, I pretty much didn't sleep, and was just, the level of stress was beyond anything I think I've ever experienced, because Mike's Australian, and he was stuck in Australia with a visa issue. And so he's making a documentary, and all of a sudden this thing's going public with or without him, it seemed. And it's like he can't even get to it's not like he could just get on a plane and like 24 hours later he's here from Australia, and okay, it could have been worse. It's, we've legit got like 10 days to wait because his visa won't let him enter the country for 10 more days. And so, it's like, is this story going to happen? What happens next? We're trying to figure out ways to buy time. And then ultimately Mike came. We started frantically writing the things to get them together. Jillian, who wrote the story for the Wall Street Journal, Jillian Melchior, needed more time to get her story together and understand what we had done than we anticipated. So we had a lot more flexibility than we thought. So Mike put out the video that I think everybody's seen now, the 7 or 8 minute clip where we told the world what we did. We wrote the piece, the 10,000 word piece for Aereo or whatever that is, and put that together. We put together a press kit so we would be able to tell the world, and we just hammered this together in 3 or 4 frantic weeks. All flew out to Portland to be in one place with Peter Boghossian because he had family and work obligations. So we all convened with him, and we went public.
And what was that like? What were the reactions like?
Oh my gosh. So for 2 or 3 days, I don't even know that it can be described what it was like. After we went public on October 2nd, and I don't know that I knew what was happening clearly at any point until sometime on the 4th or the 5th. Calls for interviews incessantly, emails asking us for comments or interviews incessantly. My Twitter just locked up and broke a bunch of times to where I couldn't use the app on my phone because it would get so many notifications. It'd fill the cache and crash my phone. I mean, it actually would crash my phone. My phone would just stop working, and I would have to uninstall Twitter and put it back to make the phone work again, repeatedly. I mean, it was just out of control for a few days. And, we're talking, it'd be, we'd roll from one interview to the next interview so fast we didn't know who we were talking to. All of a sudden I just have a phone in my hand talking to some woman. I have no idea who it is, and it's a reporter from the New York Times. And I'm just like, oh, that's who you are. Okay, whatever. And it's just one thing after another after another. And that story for the New York Times ended up on the front page of the paper on the 5th, and we didn't even know. We found out on Sunday the 7th that it had been on the front page of we made the front page of the New York Times and didn't even know because so much crazy stuff was going on. It was, as Pete likes to phrase it, absolute mayhem for about 3 or 4 days continuously. People were like, oh, you have to come be on our show, come to LA, come to New York, come to this, come to that. It's like, we can't be in like 8 places at once. What are you talking about? reporters were coming to us or trying to meet us in Portland, and it was just absolutely crazy for about 3 or 4 days, just nonstop, not even sure when to sleep. We had made a pact to more or less stay off of Twitter so we didn't get sucked into that. Uh, and so we kind of looked at it and we retweeted some stuff, but we didn't engage with anything. It was really an odd time.
What were the
It was very
reaction?
stressful.
What were the reactions? I guess what were they saying? How did they feel? Did they agree? Did they hate what you guys were doing? Like what you were doing?
Um, so they kind of were all over the map. There was a lot of excitement and support very early on. There was a lot of holy crap, what just happened kind of reactions. There were a lot of people trying to get a grasp on what was going on. It was way more confusion, I think, at first, and support than anything else, because it was almost a week or two, maybe even a full, I think it was at least a full week, and really two before anything started up where there was any real criticism coming out, except just people commenting on Twitter that we were jerks or whatever. Um, it really took them a little while to start to say negative stuff. And then even now, it's just been shocking how little uh, negativity, other than the kind of easy to ignore stuff of, people on Twitter saying we're bad people or we're not serious or whatever. And then what has come out that's been critical has been just insults or attacks on our motivations. There's been very little good criticism, which I'm sort of bummed out about, because we did this very hodgepodge. It wasn't like we had a awesome master plan. We just had the XYZW that our critics had laid out and as a roadmap and kind of followed it. So there's a lot of space where we could have done things better. Some people thought, oh, it would be better if you had set this up as a scientific experiment with control groups and things. But I don't think that actually captures the essence of what we were trying to accomplish. And so it's like a good criticism that misses the mark of what we were doing and what we did and why we were doing it. And some other people suggested, that we didn't have to be so offensive or, whatever happens to be. But there's been a fairly strong bias toward just outright support. The reactions have been much more positive than negative, and the people we expected to come after us and be negative have been, for the most part, very quiet. A friend of mine who works in academia in a humanities department told me that his guess on the reason, based on all of the conversations he has, and I'm not allowed to say who he is, he said, never tell anybody who I am, but the reason that this is because you got them and they know you got them. That's what he says. So I feel like there's been actually a lot of support, a lot of secret support too. I get emails still every day from people who either work in various sectors of academia or who work in all walks of life, really, who are thank us for what we're doing and say that they want to be able to say it but they can't.
So you got a lot of that. You got a lot of people saying that they felt the same way that you guys did, or that they agreed with your experiment, but that they feel like they can't say anything.
Thousands, all the way from, Ivy League through state colleges, through like big state schools, through, small schools, liberal arts colleges, like small liberal arts colleges, community colleges, people who work in industry, people who work in business, people who work in tech, people who have clubs, it's everywhere, people in media. Everywhere people are sending these notes. Thank you. People who work in medicine. That's the scary one for me. I wish I could speak up about this, but I have to keep my head down because XYZ, appreciate what you're doing. This is what's going on in my field. Don't tell anybody I told you this.
I think, is it Deborah So who talks about that? She's a sex scientist. And I think she's, kind of blown up in the last year or so for having a scientific approach to gender and sex, and that's a hot button topic right now, and I think she's getting kind of a lot of flack for that, but she's a scientist, and I know that's one of her just something she's dealing with right now.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually kind of the thing. That's sort of what I was referring to and sort of what led us to want to do this or part of it, is that we think that these topics need to be studied and they need to be studied rigorously. What's going on with gender and sex is important. There are a lot of difficult questions that have a lot of socio-political and cultural importance and weight. And the thinking that we had is that if you approach those with naked ideology, or as one person from an elite college phrased it to us, forwarding just prejudice and opinion under the mask of being knowledge, rather than doing rigorous research with actual scientific methods, then anything you get right, as Sam Harris noted a long time ago about faith, you get right by accident. You have to have rigorous methods. You have to have skepticism and empiricism. You have to do the test, or it's very difficult to trust the information that you have in front of you. So we wanted to see those more rigorous methods. I want to see gender and sex studied scientifically and rigorously. I like the creativity and some of the insights that I learned that the people within these fields in the humanities have. And I wish that rather than using what they call a constructivist lens that denies that biology plays a role or a significant role or as significant a role, depending on who it is. I'm not saying these, like, to qualify what I'm saying, these are three different distinct positions that the different people in these fields like gender studies have. Either that biology doesn't play a role or doesn't play much of a role, or it plays some role, but it plays significantly less of a role than in reality that it does. You very rarely find one who admits that biology is significant, in determining things about sex and then gender. I think that when you leave the conversation just to them and what they're saying, and you ignore the science, that you've got a major problem. And what you're going to get is stuff that, like I said, is at best right by accident, and at worst actually hurts the people you're trying to help. And I wish that the creative insights that they have would, instead of being forwarded as prejudice and opinion, would get brought back and tested rigorously. If you want to put forth an idea about toxic masculinity, let's talk about it. Maybe there is some kinds of stuff that works out as toxic masculinity. Maybe the name's not a very good name, but let's be very rigorous and very clear about what it is. Let's not just use it as a whip that every time some guy does something you don't like, now it's toxic masculinity.
So how do you think it was even possible for this to happen? I mean, what's going on? What is the problem I mean, you guys, all of your papers were targeted at the humanities. So, I mean, specifically with this field of study, why was it that your work was able to get through so easily?
So the answer is if I want to give a fair answer, it's a little bit complicated, but the simple kind of summary of it would be that these disciplines, gender studies, critical race theory, etc., queer theory, you can go on and list all the cultural studies. These disciplines are, and I hesitate, I shouldn't use the word disciplines because discipline is lacking. These fields are ones that exist within the humanities that do not have rigorous methodologies, that have a overwhelming political bias and very, very simplistic means for producing knowledge that is very easy to replicate and exploit. And since they don't rely on rigorous methodologies to draw their conclusions, they just rely on what works out to be kind of sloppy and circular arguments, it's pretty easy to create those and mimic what they're doing. Another way to phrase it would be, at the peer review level, you expect peer reviewers are going to have rigor and, so I have a friend who's a scientist. He submits a paper, and the stuff that comes back to him is, did you use this kind of a test when you gathered data? Did you do this? Did you reduce it that way or this way? Did you consider using whatever alpha reductase, words nobody knows? Did you do all very rigorous stuff? And I think you should reanalyze your data using this, and you should control for that, and blah blah blah. You get this very rigorous stuff that actually tightens the thing up, and all of that rigor that we all expect and have not only expect, we see in the sciences is not present because these are ultimately operating within the humanities, and instead you have this. They call it a matrix of oppression. I say it's a kind of like network of offense-based rules that you just kind of have to like navigate the minefield and not piss off the wrong people or say the wrong thing. And as long as the conclusion squares with the political ideology and you've got enough scholarship to look like you know what you're talking about, that's all it takes.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's two easy things you can do. One, click subscribe, and two, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.